Hello, I'm Dr. Chris Tranberg, Superintendent of the Branford Public Schools, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Hive Mind Headlines podcast. On this episode, we're diving into a topic that sits at the heart of everything we do as a school community, the school budget. At first glance, the budget process can feel complex or even intimidating, but at its core, it's really about values, priorities, and how we collectively invest in the success of our students and our schools. In this conversation, we'll break down the basics of how the school budget works, walk through the key procedural components, and explore how school districts can move beyond the status quo to take more innovative, forward-thinking approaches to budgeting. I'm excited to be joined by two voices who play a critical role in this work: Branford Public Schools Chief Operating Officer Blaize Levitan and the Town of Branford's Director of Finance, Jim Finch. Together, they'll help us better understand not just the how of school budgeting, but the why behind the decisions, and how collaboration between the district and the town helps drive systemic improvement. At Branford Public Schools, we are deeply committed to continuous improvement and to making decisions that strengthen our district for the long term. The budget is one of the most powerful tools we have to turn vision into action, and it's something we all have a stake in. Whether you're a parent, staff member, student, or community partner, your understanding, engagement, and voice truly matter. So let's take this opportunity to learn together, ask better questions, and explore how we can all play a role in making a meaningful difference for our schools and community. Let's get started. It's my pleasure to welcome Blaize and Jim to the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a few questions to get started. And when you take the question, also just introduce yourself a bit and say how long you've been with the town and in your role. And so to get started, for listeners who may not be familiar with school finance, can you walk us through some of the basics of how the budget works and what it's designed to accomplish?
Yeah, I'll take that first. This is Blaize Levitan. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Branford Public Schools, and I've been with Branford Schools since April of 2024. And prior to that, I was the COO of Greenwich Public Schools, and it's been a really great time to be here. We have a really good budget process. We have a great partnership doing this podcast with Jim. I feel very fortunate to do that because he's an excellent finance director for a town. And one of the main things in school finance is that the school needs to work really closely with the town. And Branford community should be really proud that Branford Schools and Branford Town Hall have a really close working relationship, and this process is done sort of hand in hand. School budgeting is a year-round process. It's a 12-month process, even though the superintendent doesn't present until January. In the summertime, we start modeling out all the labor contracts. We meet with all the principals. We get a high level of needs. For our facility assessments, we have our facilities director, security director, and tech director walk the buildings, meet together, and think about priority. And we spend a few months really doing analysis. By October, all of the schools and departments have actually built all of their budgets. And so you think of a challenge kind of for a principal and how close we all have to work together is they're really anticipating needs a year and a half to 2 years in advance of when they'll be needed as part of the budgeting process. So a lot of thought has to go into it. A big piece of the budget, most of what the school budget is actually contractual. So between labor contracts and salary and benefits and everything, 75% of the budget is personnel costs and is generally fixed in your labor and health insurance. So most of that modeling is really important because that drives the biggest cost. And then you have fixed costs in your building contracts, your transportation contracts, and your multi-year items that have been done through a competitive bidding process. So we model all those out, and then that leaves actually a fairly small amount of discretionary spending. But that discretionary spending is what makes a big impact also in a classroom. So we're really thoughtful there. Then, the Board of Ed gets the budget from the superintendent, usually in January. The superintendent presents their budget for the community. The Board of Ed meets and has a series of workshops to understand and interpret the budget. And the Board of Ed then votes and has to hand the budget over to the town, and the town takes it from there. A few pieces that we've done in prep is that the board and the town give us guidelines, early on. So before we get too far down the road of budget development, and maybe Jim, you can kind of talk about some of the things that you think about in your guidelines too. We get guidelines from the town that relate to sort of affordability, and we get some priority guidelines from the board members so that it's more of a collaborative process. We do some workshops before the superintendent presents. And at a high level, that's what things look like on the board side. What about the town?
Yeah, I think from the town side, we sort of look at it from a much a broader, more global lens. And we look at the various stakeholders, and there are certainly many. Obviously, our citizens. Our citizens have various needs. We look at it from the children. We look at it based on current generations and future generations. And in many ways, I think one way we look at the budget is sort of like the town is basically providing a bundle of services. So picture in your household, you're buying a bundle of services, and the cost you pay for that is your taxes. And trying to balance between those various stakeholders is challenging at times. So the Board of Finance typically has some overall guidelines. Um, and one is to maintain investment in our current services and infrastructure. That could be our rolling stock, that could be our buildings, and various equipment, etc. The other is they try to be faithful to future generations. So they don't want to typically kick the can down the road, which is a commonly used phrase, and we are very much aware of what our liabilities are and what our decisions relate to future taxpayers. So that goes into our thinking when it comes to our bonding, which is typically the amount of money we borrow. Think of it as terms of the town's mortgages and car payments. We look at it in terms of funding pensions for employees and other legacy costs. A way to think of that in a household budget is, are you saving money for retirement? Well, Blaize had talked about contractual obligations. We have contractual obligations to our employees, so we need to fund those and invest those in a way. And overall, we try to do things that are make sense, they're logical, and they're budget friendly. And so when it relates to the Board of Ed, the question is, well, how does the Board of Ed fit into that? Well, on many different fronts. One, it's a service that many in the community either rely on, either directly by having children or maybe grandchildren. So that they've all kind of touched the school system at one time. The schools are our largest employer within the town budget, and they also have a significant infrastructure, mainly in terms of their buildings and maybe to a lesser extent rolling stock and facilities. Whereas the town's infrastructure certainly is buildings, but it also includes, like I said, streets, treatment plants, and other things. And so when we're looking at the town budget, we want to get an understanding of what is driving the school budget, what are their goals, what are their aspirations. For example, this past year, the school system embarked on a facilities plan, probably maybe even a year and a half, actually, looking forward, kind of building on, the relationships we built in the past. So, for example, the Walsh School was done back in 2016. Then we had the field project that recently got completed. We were looking at roughly $11.5 million for roofs and other improvements at the high school. So the town has to have that on its dashboard because a lot of these projects are funded through debt. And so it has to fit in with what our needs are at the police station, fire station, and those following Branford budget. And talks probably know that the town is looking at a public works facility. So there's a lot of ingredients that go into the recipe. And, in the end, we think we do a fairly good job that when Graham Care takes it out of the oven, it usually tastes pretty good. And a little bit about me, which I probably should have led off with, is I've been here nearly 28 years. So I started in 1998. That's a little eye opening at times, recognizing that some of the people that work in town hall weren't even born when I was hired. But I think I have a young spirit regardless. I've seen a lot of different things over the years through state budget crisis, through the financial collapse and crisis, through COVID. And so it's been a challenge, but it's also been rewarding. And I look forward to answering whatever other questions you have on the town budget and town finances.
Great, thanks. Based on your experience, have you encountered any misconceptions that people have about the process itself? So, for example, Blaze mentioned that about 75% of the Board of Ed budget is pretty tightly fixed based on just labor and benefits alone. Are there other things that would just help demystify some common misconceptions people have
Specifically about the Board of Ed budget or in general?
in general?
In general, I think some folks think that we engage at times in reckless spending, which typically relates to somebody who doesn't support a project because it doesn't benefit them. But I think it's important for that sort of framework to be analyzed by saying, well, we're all part of a community. We're dealing with different needs in different sequences. So, for example, if you're a senior, maybe you're not enthusiastic about the Walsh project, but certainly the athletic community and our children are. So we have to be faithful to that group. But we also do senior programming. We did the community house and we did that. There's that bias. I think that if folks actually looked at what their services cost, if you broke down every single service in terms of if it was all on a bill, they would find that a lot of the town services are not expensive for the average taxpayer. I think that sometimes also, I think the environment we live in has an impact on that. I think, someone could be listening to a radio talk show and their opinions about government may also flow down to their local community. And I think many of them are sometimes surprised to find out that, in fact, no, we are actually dealing with the issues that are being talked about. And they may read about the state of Connecticut over the years and other communities about their pension costs and their other post-employment benefit costs, which are basically legacy costs for retirees. And then they wonder, well, is Branford dealing with this? And the answer is yes, we are. And so I think sometimes the more they learn about the town, and we're certainly not perfect by any stretch, I think the more they learn it, the more inclined they are to take some pride in their town. But having said that, I think most people that I've encountered do have an accurate perception of what their government is and what their government does. Our meetings are all publicized. We have a 30-member RTM. We have various boards and commission. And I think people like to see projects and things getting done. And certainly they see things getting done in Branford. So I think that's important. Another misconception that was out there this past year is that the revaluation was done simply to raise revenue. And I can emphatically say that that's not true. The revaluation, without getting into the nuts and bolts of it, is really a shift in who pays. The slices of the pie are changing, but the pie itself is not growing dramatically. So, for example, in the budget that we're in, the tax levy went up 1.7%, and many people experienced a greater tax increase in that because of the revaluation. But the 1.7% is all in aggregate that the town budget took from the taxpaying public.
Right. Thanks for that clarification. Anything to add, Blaze, to misconceptions?
I think that a lot of times people think of money too a little bit too abstractly, and you'll appreciate me saying this, but the budget is ultimately the single most important policy document of the Board of Ed and of the town. And so we really, think strategically about how we spend money. But what really matters, at the end of the day is you can say a lot of things, you can have policies, but what really will matter is where you're committing resources. And so that's how the board and that's how a community convey what is important to them is through the budget document. And you really need to align your vision and values to that. And so we don't really think of internally, we don't think of money kind of separate. We think about it, and I think a good way to picture it is picturing it actually powering things right into the classroom. And you're making a decision with every dollar that you're spending that it's a hard-earned taxpayer dollar, and then you're making the decision to spend that, and that is how you are conveying what's important. And I think a lot of times people kind of think about like, oh, well, it's money, so that's separate from this. But we've done a really good job. I think I'm fairly proud over the last year of really making a lot of effort to connect the budget directly sort of to the board's strategic plan as well, so that what's being said and done through a vetting process of strategy and long-term vision is then reflected in the dollars that are ultimately put into a classroom. So that's sort of a kind of a big misconception. I think when you reframe how people think about money in a way that it's actually conveying what's important and providing those resources to do so, that helps a better conversation about the budget. It does make the budget conversation a little more intense. Without viewing it that way, you end up kind of talking about things that are not important. You'll end up talking about 5,000 here or $1,000 here. Those are big dollar amounts. But if you do it that way, you're not thinking about it in terms of vision and strategy. And so it's very important to think about every dollar in that way instead and what you're committing
Yeah, and I
to is
think the
to.
Board of Finance in the town sort of embraces that. I think that's reflected in
Definitely.
what I was saying about the paying down liabilities and being faithful to future
Yes.
generations is a big value. And other areas where the town looks at things is on the environments. We have a clean energy task force, and I know the board is working closely with them on that. I think your decision on the electric buses, although I think that's somewhat controversial at times, and maybe that could go into the misconception category. But that's something I think the three of us and others are working on to try to dispel some of those misconceptions. And So that's something that is a value, I think, in terms of some of the other projects the town has looked at over the years, like you guys looking at the green bank projects for the roof. The town, set up a coastal resiliency funds for climate change issues, and also was involved in writing a law with that. So these are all things that kind of reflect our values, and I think the town also is financially conservative, which has been a hallmark over the last probably 3 decades. So I think that's another element, and that has served us well back in. One of the financial crisis where the governor was proposing a budget that eliminated all Branford's state aid. And so we had sort of made this asymmetrical bet where we basically had used a large fund balance to offset potential state cuts. So we took the taxpayer out of that bet, but we knew that we could at least cover things until the dust settled. And I remember saying to your predecessor, Chris Hamlet Hernandez, I said, right now, because of this, we now become spectators of the state budget process and not victims of it. And it actually worked out pretty well in the end, thankfully. But
It's a good segue into the next question I had was going into the transportation piece. So, as listeners may or may not be aware, Brantford's on track to become the first school district in New England with a fully electrified bus fleet. And so, in any given year, there could be something major that's happening in a budget that becomes a driver. So, how can a project like this change the way we think about budget in a single fiscal year? And keep in mind, this will be airing after my budget's already been presented and workshopped. So what are some of the things that we think about when there might be an unexpected or big item that appears in the budget?
if we're talking about the buses specifically, I think there's a couple aspects of this. So I know that the board and school administrations are very cognizant as to what the overall increase is year to year. And, large increases typically probably are not good news for the superintendents and the board. But on the other hand, as Blaize was talking about, well, what are sort of the values, right? And so that's where I think the communication with the town, I think, is important because the town has different tools and approaches to solve some of these problems. Um, at least they have the ability to. And now we could kind of talk about the willingness. And I think the willingness is really is derived from a better understanding of the issues and how it impacts. And I think a lot of it is sometimes the narrative is more important than the numbers, or as important as the numbers. And I think it's kind of how you frame it. And because even myself, with when it relates to the transportation issues, my knowledge is really only on the surface of it. I'm really kind of focusing on cash flows, not all the stuff that flows up to the cash flows. But I think it's important, like I said, for us to understand that and see what tools we have available. Because, again, as I said at the outset, one of the goals is to kind of pass budgets that are logical and budget sensitive from what we have to raise in taxes. And so you don't want that leading to a misconception, whereas my taxes went up because of fill in the blank, if it's in this case, transportation. And then there's also other non-financial benefits of that. As you guys both know, we had the opportunity to ride on one of the school buses, and it was a different than the experience I had riding a school bus. It was quiet, it was well heated, and it was able to make some good turns. I found some of the other aspects of it kind of interesting. The regenerative braking aspects and other elements of it. And quite honestly, I was kind of impressed with how battery technology has advanced to a stage where, um, it's leaps and bounds ahead of probably where it was even 5 years ago, and what the trade-offs and benefits are of that. Unfortunately, you can't put 28,000 people in a school bus. So the challenge before us is really how to communicate that, and then how do we marry that to a financial strategy that works. And also, when you talk about stakeholders, Brantford is a town in the state. So I think we've all discussed trying to expand that to the other stakeholders, and there are other stakeholders that share a common vision. So, to the extent we could align the common vision, I think to your Blaize goal, what is the vision? What is our priorities? And then and trying to link that to funding sources, I think is a good approach to take.
Yes, and I should also say, I promise, Jim, I will play no clips of this podcast as evidence for my budget presentation to any other boards. So,
Yeah, I think it's important too, if I could add on it just a little bit, is we do a lot of work to when you're thinking about when we talk about budget, right? Budget's actually, and I should have probably said this in the misconceptions, but there's multiple pieces that make up a budget. It's actually, a multi-funding source thing. We're primarily at the Board of Ed thinking about our operating budget, which is our annual expenditures within that given year for all of your labor, your supplies, your materials, your day-to-day operating costs. And then you also have your capital expenditures, your large scale assets, your buildings, your repairs and infrastructure investments. And we try to do things Jim mentioned, you don't want to shock. And so most of what we try to do is have stable, predictable financial models. And with most of what we do with the large scale expenditures is even though we only appropriate as a town, which is common, in 1-year increments, we need to think in multi-year planning. So when we're doing capital, we think about between Jim mentioned earlier, we did a master facilities plan. So that facilities plan is covering 15 to 30 years of infrastructure mapping and needs. And when we're doing capital, this budget, even when we submit it for 27, it will be a 1-year request, but have 4 more years that we're projecting. And we're putting a lot of effort in trying to make those out years more accurate so that our colleagues at the town side can have it they need all their departments and stakeholders to do that so that then they can plan to keep things stable and predictable in the out years. Even so, if we take the transportation example that you're talking about, the goal is to try to also mitigate the impact of the shock, of budget shock, and so we work on we know that things are coming. We have a multi-year contract. So in budget design, as the superintendent, you're really making resource decisions at a multi-year level too. You're thinking about, okay, this year we're gonna have to prioritize some funding. We know that there's gonna be a significant increase in this cost in year 3 or in year 5. And so you have to make some, different resource decisions, and you try to do that with a framework of more than just the 1 year so that you do prohibit. And then you try to do some smoothing where you can, and some smart strategic planning so that, like Jim said, something about Branford specifically that I think a lot of the Branford community can be proud of is there is a lot of planning for out years so that when it comes down to cash flow for these large scale projects, the cash is there so that projects, can get done that need to get done without causing some type of major budgetary constraint, if that's sort of a fair way to think about it.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think because the town is, it may sound self-serving, but I mean the town is financially healthy. I don't know if it's because of me or in spite of me, but nevertheless, the town is financially healthy, and because of that, it provides a level of flexibility even in terms of when we borrow, and that's one of the aspects we use when we kind of manage our debt service as well. And our debt service would be the money we pay back on money we borrow, similar to someone's mortgage or a car payment. So having money in the bank is a nice problem to have, but it does assist us, especially with cash flow. And looking down the road, when you're looking at large capital needs, that really would distinguish Brantford from other places because we're able to structure our financing in ways that other communities just would not have the capacity to do so.
We're fairly aggressive too in this project specifically, and with a lot of other projects Branford's Branford's been pretty fortunate because of the good work that we all put into it, which is securing other funding sources. So for this infrastructure project, prior to the change in federal policy along electrification, we secured nearly half of the funding with our partners at Zoom and at the state and other funding sources alone, and then Zoom's working on some of the other funding. And a lot of the pressures that we're seeing in transportation are less about, for us here in Branford specifically, are less about electrification and more an impact too of what's happening in transportation across the state. If well, I was just at the Association of School Business Officials conference, everyone's talking about transportation. The costs were sort of artificially low, pre-COVID, and going into COVID, there's been these massive increases. So you're seeing in transportation it's not unlikely to see 30% increases, in transportation over a very short time frame as the costs of transportation as a service have just drastically increased around the state. We had kind of with a multi-year contracting, you get the benefit in the good times, and then you have some issues if when you're contracting in more difficult financial times, and sometimes that ends up catching up with you because you had benefits for so many years where you were locked in at a lower price, and really a previous vendor ate a lot of cost in potential minimal profit or loss because we had locked in competitive bid pricing, and so that's sort of what you see. You can think about that even how significant it would be is that, even with some of our buses at a diesel rate or an electric rate, we're still lower than what other communities are paying just for transportation as a service for a much less quality of service. And we have even right now with our buses, when we switch to this contract, they're new, and the facility's brand new, and they have technology that other bus companies don't have. And then we'll have electric buses, and we'll still be ultimately, even though it's a substantial impact overall, transportation's a large cost. It's still in comparison to what's happening in other communities. Branford's been able to kind of even still mitigate that in comparison to what a lot of our colleagues are going through across the state in transportation.
Thanks.
And I think that's a very important point that uh, kind of needs to be framed in a way that folks can kind of see that benefit because right now the electric buses, I think, and again, I'm talking from a limited understanding, is kind of if it was a candidate, it's running against itself, right? But the point Blaze raises is, well, does it have a compared to what advantage to something else? And the other aspect of it compared to what advantage, I think, is the fact that most contracts are 5 years. This is 10 years. So, with the understanding that in year six, those other towns are going to reprice. Then their last 5 years then would have to be compared to our last 5 years, but our last 5 years are pretty much already known, right? And is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So,
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that perspective. I'm going to pivot a little bit. I had a colleague who I worked with for 7 years, and he gives everyone this book that works in the organization. It's the Maxwell Daily Reader. It's a daily lessons on leadership. And I knew that I had to read it every day because it was going to come into my life at some point during that day. And so I still read it almost every day. And today's lesson was about pointing out a great strength of someone in your life. And the basic idea, if you've read any of Maxwell's stuff, he talks a lot about as leaders specifically, we need to spend more time becoming really strong at the things we're great at and not try to be great at everything because we can't be. But the direction from today's lesson is to point out strengths in other people. And so I just wanted to name with both of you, just working with both of you is just has been, it's been a really, really great pleasure and joy. And one of your strengths collectively is working together between like the school and municipality. And Blaze mentioned in the intro that's not always the case. So can you either of you or both of you talk a little bit about like what does it take for the school and the town to work together, especially on initiatives that are breaking new ground? So we talked enough about electrification, but there's other things that we've done as well. So whether it's master facilities, whether strengthening our partnership with the Branford Community Foundation, there's just unique and innovative things that happen in Branford. And having been other places, it doesn't happen often and it doesn't happen as quickly. So how important is that relationship between the town and the municipality and the school?
I mean, I think it's essential, and I think when these challenges can't be solved in a vacuum. And I think we talked about meeting the needs of the other stakeholders, but I think it's sometimes finding partnerships with other entities that have common goals and vision, right? And so, the Board of Ed is if they're looking at a financial issue or problem, they're sort of looking at I mean, as they should within certain limited constraints, right? So a town could actually look at things a little bit more globally, and the state could even look at things more globally. And then, you guys have partnered with other, non-state actors who are nevertheless in a business that can actually assist you, whether it's the Bradford Community Foundation, who the town actually used as well to administer the ARPA program, whether it's working with our state reps, whether it's working with the Connecticut Green Bank. But I think a lot of people, at least in our roles, who are committed to public service, it's not just a job; it's a bit more of a calling. Get a sort of a psychological high or capital from solving problems. But you can't solve problems unless you know what they are. And so, kind of sharing the common challenges or some uncommon challenges, I think it provides an element of fellowship of sorts, where you could actually, discuss and brainstorm and feel free to do so without being judged or criticized. So I think that's sort of the elements of what's needed. So
When you're in a good partnership, like Jim mentioned, you've got to be kind of willing to be a little vulnerable too when you're in the low times. And that means kind of putting some of your cards out on the table that with challenges you're facing and coming to a conclusion that, you're in a good, strong, supportive community where people have shared vision and want to see the success of our local services and our local community. And when you go into it with that mindset, I think it allows us to build a partnership of trust, and shared kind of vision. Everyone has a lot of the similar challenges that they're facing. The challenges we could all say are the same ones that the town will mostly say, and a lot of nonprofits will say: labor costs, rising utilities, inflation post COVID. And so we're all dealing with a lot of similar, drastically increased building costs from what were previously modeled or anticipated in a very short time frame. And so to solve these really complicated challenges, you just can't do it on your own, but you also can't just expect other folks or other stakeholders to just solve your problems for you or to kind of pretend that they don't exist. You need to kind of address them head on. And what I think people really value here in Branford is we're lucky with our structure of government between town hall and the board of ed, and we have a board of finance, and we have a representative town meeting that allows bodies to work together. I would agree with you, Dr. Tranberg, that that's not always the case where these bodies, it's really complicated. It takes a lot of time and effort to bring. Jim mentioned earlier, the RTM is 30 people. You have a board of finance, a board of education. These are all people who are volunteers that have oversight responsibilities, and the first selectman who is the chief executive officer of running a town day to day. And so you have to be intentional about it. You have to really put a lot of prioritization in the value that you have for each other's perspectives. And what people in Branford, I think, are really proud of is that we take a lot of time and effort, not just we, like as in the people at this table, but we as a community put a lot of time into coming together. Liza, Petra, you mentioned the Branford Community Foundation. We have all of these other partners who get together frequently to tackle problems in a way that is just really incredible. And that I personally also being in other communities that have great, structures and come together too. But Branford comes together in a way that a lot of things happen, and they happen much faster than I think people expect in government. I mean, government you're talking, I just mentioned how many people to do anything that we're doing. basically it has to go through all of the people that we just mentioned, like compared to a private company where, one or two people can make a decision. We're navigating sometimes to make any decision 20 to 70 people to generally agree on the shared vision. I'm proud that in Branford, we do a lot of that. And we have a lot of strong nonprofit groups like the Branford Community Foundation that already have existing infrastructure in place to do things. The town has an infrastructure. They're ultimately a chartered entity from the state. They have a lot of different tools Jim keeps mentioning that a Board of Ed has. The Board of Ed has some different tools than the town has through the State Department of Education and access of programs we have. And the Branford Community, Foundation, for example, one of our closest partners, has different tools and infrastructure set up than what we have. And so instead of trying to go it alone, by going together, you can tap into everybody's different strengths and the infrastructure that they already have set up for those services, and we can leverage each other together. And it's something that we do actually quite frequently, really here in Branford.
Yeah, and other examples, exclusive outside of the Port of Ed, where the town has done that, is we worked very closely with the library, about Blackstone Library 4 years ago. Many people probably don't know this, but Blackstone Library is an independent 501(c)(3). They are not a
Right.
town library. Most of the budget, probably 95% of it or so, is funded by the town, but they also have an endowment and they have a separate board of directors. And so the town worked very closely with them about 4 or 5 years ago to stabilize the endowment, work on an investment policy, but that needed a reset in the budget year. So that would be another example of an outside organization. And when the Foot Trust was looking to divest from the park, there were meetings in probate with the various beneficiaries, the town being one, and two churches. And that was a collaborative exercise as well, and kind of leveraging what all of our strengths were. So, like the church would have a need, but the town also had other tools it could do. And, we worked very closely with the trust. I'll spare you the details. But again, I think the common element in all of this is really, trust and communication, willingness to listen, and a willingness to be open and try to solve common problems. Another thing I will say is, and not have fragile egos, quite honestly.
Mm.
So it's,
Yeah.
it's not to say it any plainer than that.
Yeah. It's very true. I'll add too, Dr. Tranberg, as a specific example too, that's recent, and just to kind of give it some credit to the Branford Community Foundation, we've done a lot of partnership with the Branford Community Foundation as of recent. And Liza is just obviously anyone who knows her, the executive director. She's this amazing person who has a lot of energy, and the Branford Community Foundation has this really incredible group of people who have something they're looking to do, which is help out the Branford community. And when we've brought them some problems that some folks might not know have existed, where, nearly 1 in 3 students in our school district are on free and reduced lunch. And we have kids right here in Branford this is a real problem where kids can't maybe afford to eat. And so the Branford Community Foundation, we've done sort of a soft launch already of a new fund established there of the Branford Education Fund, and it's aimed at increasing access for students who have trouble accessing different services. We're starting with food as sort of a basic, like we want people to be able to eat, and not getting, building up lunch debt on their account, and maybe you don't qualify for free and reduced lunch, but you still have a hard time, affording to eat in a way that can promote learning. And so the Branford Community Foundation has been able to set up this fund aiming to support access. And when we think about access a little broadly, there's things that the school district can't buy a student, a personal pair of cleats, but you do maybe need a nice pair of cleats to participate in sports, or same thing with musical instruments. And they've actually been able to provide some of that support where, hey, a kid can't afford the cleats, and they've bought the cleats for the kid. And we've built out some partnerships like that so that we can expand access, and we're formalizing that. And if you go on to the Branford Community Foundation website, there is the Branford Education Fund. I'll give it a plug right now while we're doing it in the podcast, because it is there and it exists. And it's really going to very good use, which is helping kids afford to eat and participate in programs in their community.
Great. Thanks for the shout out. Can we talk a little bit about just the basic difference between a capital budget and the operating budget? Specifically, because when we get into budget season and there are these large scale capital items, and you also might be dealing with something like a reduction in force, it's easy for people to say, well, why are you putting in new floors somewhere and you are reducing these positions? So what is the capital budget and how does it differentiate from the operating?
I think if you think about it this way, projects by their very nature tend to be, you know, one time upfront, and then they tend to have a useful life. And so that lends itself typically to being financed over time. So you typically would want to finance a project over its useful life, or certainly not longer than its useful life. There are some things that sometimes could be a bit of a gray area, but if you think about the Walsh Intermediate School project was obviously a capital project. A lot of the large improvement projects at the schools would be capital projects. And then we also have, at least on a town side, more like sinking funds. Maybe one might think of it like the old Christmas clubs where you would save from for 12 months and then, or 11 months, and then on the 12th month you would go out and buy gifts for it. That's a way that the town could sometimes fund these capital improvements or putting money aside. Really, as Blaize talked about, and we've talked about in the past about the smoothing. The thing is, from the town side, everybody's capital project that's financed ends up being part of the town's operating budget ultimately because the mortgage payment is really paid by the town. No general fund department has their own debt service account. When it comes to the leases for the technology, that's a shared expense. The leases on the technology was something that came about where the board was being asked to come up with a technology plan that was sustainable, and I sort of freelanced on that, and I was like, "Well, tell me what your needs are." And this was actually just before COVID. It worked out well that they had all this technology before COVID. Certainly didn't have that foresight, but that's an example of other approaches. And so those leases are typically also part of the um, capital budget, at least on the town side, even though a Chromebook wouldn't be a capital expenditure. So it's kind of at the in between area. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
Yeah, I think for the sake of simplicity, when we're kind of thinking about the budget at the Board of Ed, at a board level, we think about it in three buckets, three main pieces of the budget that take a lot of policy and discussion. Your operating budget, your day-to-day expenditures, and those are directly funded by the immediate levy of the tax levy of the next year. And so that is all of your ongoing operating expenses, your labor, your wages, your benefits to get through the given day. Your capital expenditures are then your big bucket infrastructure. They have a useful life, they have a larger dollar value, they depreciate. They're things that depreciate over time, and they have cyclical replacement schedules, a water boiler, a roof. And then we have grants and separate funds as our third bucket. So we get a lot of funding, from the U.S. Department of Education and the State Department of Education for title grants or IDEA, and then our food services program. And those buckets are all highly regulated and have very specific uses that they can be applied to that are directed by the granting agencies. And those are kind of the three separate buckets. They all coordinate together. You have to coordinate those pieces together, but they're fundamentally different. They have different rules, they have different funding mechanisms. The operating budget, how it sort of works is for a Board of Ed is the state gives the Board of Ed exclusive like line item management of an operating budget. And then it's the entity that's making all of the individual line item decisions. And then the town is only allowed to basically make lump sum adjustments. And then if they make any adjustments, the Board of Ed has to allocate those, but they're the entity. And so in theory, the town really, they can't say like, well, I want you to reduce a teacher position at this school. And so we're going to cut your budget to do that. They can cut the budget by the value, but the Board of Ed places it. On capital, that is very different. The town is the entity that actually ultimately controls all of capital, line item, project item. So all of this takes extensive coordination and partnership because there's just legal differences between how authority and control and oversight over the funds and how they get managed. And then our granting funds that I mentioned too also have all of their own oversight structures and their own rules and regulations that go with them, and reporting that take specific use and have very specific use alignments, and who has authority over those funds and how they get appropriated. So you're pulling all those pieces together. You mentioned someone though might say like, well, you're reducing this position, but you're spending money in capital, and don't you have you had just asked for 10 million for a roof, but you're gonna do this, and that's a one-time expenditure, and they have different allowable uses too. With certain capital funds, and Jim, you can articulate this better than I, you're not gonna take certain capital funds and apply them in your operating budget. And some of our grants that we get, most of the grant funding we get can't be used to supplant services. They have to be used to supplement and expand the services. And they're not allowed to basically, well, you're gonna cut this over here in your operating, so can't you just take, well, you get 800,000 for, IDEA combined. Can't you just cover it over here? No, that would not be allowed for the rules. So I think that's a very important distinction
Yeah, and
between
I
those
think that
three
was a great
levels.
explanation, specifically as it relates to the Board of Ed, because I mean, the town does fund some capital items in its operating budget directly. It's called pay as you go. Example might be, you had to replace a small roof somewhere. You would just pay for it instead of borrowing it, even though the roof has a useful life of, say, 20 years. So the town has roughly about, including the Board of Ed piece of this with the leases and coastal resiliency fund, probably about 4.4 million in the current budget of pay as you go capital project in the operating budget. And that's a way to really save on interest costs, and I think that's also a positive for the rating agencies when they see you're doing that, because they know if you hit a crisis, you'd have some flexibility. You could then cut back on that if you had to. But there's things that the town pays for in cash that other communities would borrow.
I think what might be important, Dr. Tranberg, too, is just to acknowledge. I think it's Jim and I try to do this, but sometimes when you're talking about the nuts and bolts of things, you can sort of forget. But when we come back to that, it is the most important policy document. It is important to acknowledge that you're talking about the mechanics of money, but money impacts, someone's job, or money impacts what the experience is in a classroom, or how much somebody's paying for something. And then on the flip side, it's impacting how much they're paying in taxes. And so every single decision you need to, it's good to understand how these kind of complicated funding mechanisms come together. But I always think it's important to kind of acknowledge that there's very real people and experiences and services being provided at the end of every single one of those decisions. And so it's nothing that you can take lightly, and you can't build one easier than you can build the other. And you have to try to piece them together to always try to produce the best product you can, while maintaining all of the key stakeholders who ultimately are impacted by every single one of those decisions, because someone's job is going to be impacted, and someone's ability to pay their taxes is going to be impacted, and so is potentially a child's experience in the classroom is going to be impacted by every single decision we're making when we're doing this. And I think it's important to just
Yeah,
always
and that's
acknowledge
kind of
that.
an emerging research topic in government finance now, is how do you expand the voices in the budget process. There's certain cities and areas, there's folks that are disenfranchised that don't really have a voice in the budget process. And how do you identify those voices, and how do you incorporate that into your decision making? I think there's times, even when I'm talking either to a first selectman or you guys, I'm like, sometimes I wonder, to your point about the technicalities of all this, I say to myself, say to the group, I say, is this too much inside baseball? What is the actual community need? What is the problem we're trying to solve, and how do we do it? And is that what the community needs, or is it based on a need, or is it based on something anecdotal? What is it really based on? And are there voices that aren't basically part of the process? And how do we reach out to those groups? I think is a challenge nationally. I can't really speak directly to Branford, but I do sometimes wonder if we're missing voices. And so I guess if somebody listens to that podcast and they're a missing voice, I'll probably hear from them.
Mm.
So
No, that's a great point. To wrap us up, when you think 5 or 10 years down the road, and this is for both of you, but especially for Jim, because for those of you that don't know, Jim is sadly, very sadly for us, retiring. Is it March 6th?
yeah.
So very soon. And we're happy that we have a great replacement for him, Catherine LaBanca. We will miss Jim terribly. But with that said, 5, 10 years down the road, what do you hope people will say about the financial decisions that Branford made during right now this period?
I would hope that the history is very kind to these decisions. I would hope that they would look and say, while they may not have been perfect, that the community has benefited and that there's various stakeholders that could point to something that happened that made their lives better. Whether it's a school, whether it's a field, whether it's when they go to the library. And I would also hope that at some level, our employees would know that, example, the police, that their pension fund is well invested. I think with the police also, I think the decision to bring back the defined benefit plan and set up a second tier was something that folks thought we were crazy at the time, and now more folks are doing that. And I find interesting when I see reports coming out of the state of Connecticut. We're doing an overhaul. We're going to come up with a second tier, and we're going to change our investment strategy and use more passive investments. I'm like, if that's something we've been doing. So, no, I hope they look back and look at these years and say a lot was accomplished, and that these generations are getting the benefit of it. So I hope it serves as a recipe for folks to continue doing that. If we could demonstrate what works, then I think you continue to do that until it doesn't work. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and that's juxtaposed as well. That's how we always did it. I know that's always that kind of conflict, but no, I do think people, I hopefully will remember history well and look at these as good decisions in the context of some difficult times, whether it's COVID, the financial crisis, etc. So.
And I don't know that they even, need to just remember it. I think if people walk around the community, you can really see it because at the end of the day, this all the decisions and Jim's been at the helm for nearly 3 decades, but we're sitting here at the Walsh campus with this brand new kind of beautiful state of the art school, and you can walk right around the other side and see the really incredible athletic complex that took years of planning and financial kind of stewardship to be able to have the resources to do those projects. And if you walk around sort of the rest of the community, you can see a lot of these other assets around town, or we can see these really incredible resources. I mean, we walk around the school and we see students having these opportunities and these experiences that are a lot of times unique to what their educational experience is in Branford, and that's ultimately because of with a lower mill rate or tax rate than surrounding communities for similar experiences. And that's all because of decades worth of financial decisions to get here. So if you kind of just look around, you see, and I think we'll be seeing them potentially for years to come. I think you and I, we although Jim won't be sitting here with us and he's approaching his retirement, that's well deserved. But the decisions that he's making even now and over the last few years, Jim, you were part of the capital process. We had the RTM, we had the Board of Finance, we had the Selectmen and Town Finance along with the Board of Ed to do the master plan and to set some financial mechanisms in place so that we can still continue to tackle the elementary school major infrastructure projects that are needed, as well as multiple pieces of financing. We're going to be putting on a desperately needed roof at the high school, and that is happening in a way that's financially sustainable for all the folks involved. And that's all because of the decisions that really have been made, for years to get here to be able to sustain things like that. But you can see them everywhere you look.
And Main Street's going to be reconstructed in the next year or so. So that's another big project, but it's hard to put it all into words, Chris. But yeah, I just hope that people thought that their government made the right moves and did projects that helped them and benefit and continues to. I mean, I think of it as kind of a relay race. It's like now that baton is getting passed, whoever gets it, has to run their race. But like I said before in a different context about the future of Brantford, and I simply said if it was a stock, I would buy it.
I think that's the perfect last word for the episode. So thank you both for your time. If you'd like to follow the budget process, you can visit the BranfordSchools.org website. We have a budget page that will have all the documents, and the process is long. The presentations start in January, and finalized in May, so you have plenty of time to actively engage. I want to thank Blaize and Jim for joining me today and helping make a complex topic more accessible, transparent, and grounded in purpose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The school budget isn't just a policy document, it's a reflection of who we are, what we value, and what kind of future we want to build together. Whether you're a parent, staff member, student, or community partner, your engagement matters. Asking questions, staying informed, and participating in the process helps strengthen not just the budget, but the entire system. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hive Mind Headlines. Until next time, let's keep learning, reading, and working together to make a meaningful difference for our schools and our community. Thanks for joining us on this journey and for being such an important part of what makes Branford an amazing place to live, learn, and grow. You can catch new episodes of Hive Mind Headlines on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and our district website at branfordschools.org. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to help others find the show. Let's celebrate all that makes Branford special.